All right, hi everyone. This is lecture video 11, where we're going to discuss advanced cognitive processes. So we'll talk about things like concepts, critical thinking, creativity, decision making, problem solving, that sort of thing. There will not be a particular activity that we'll be discussing in this lecture video. So just let me know if you have any questions about the content or about anything in the class. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so as I said, today's lecture is going to focus on some cognitive processes. We're going to talk about several today. We're going to start off by talking about concepts. So we will define concepts as well as discuss the importance of using concepts in the classroom. But as I said, some of the other topics we're going to cover today involve critical thinking, decision making, as well as towards the end of this lecture talking about how to transfer what we've learned in the classroom to meaningful real-world situations, which is when we know that learning has really happened. So starting off with talking about concepts, let's have a definition. Concepts are categories that group objects, events, and characteristics on the basis of common properties. Now, I think that this is one of the most common ways that we teach information to children. And there's a reason why we use concepts. Our brains like this. Our brains are designed to group things together, to make categories. And we do this almost all the time without even realizing it. But for example, when I was teaching my kids about the different types of animals, and you'll see an example of a concept map with this in a second on the next slide. But I would talk about, okay, this is what makes a mammal a mammal. This is what makes a reptile a reptile. And so we would have a concept of a particular class of animal, and then we would group together animals that go together based on common characteristics or common properties. And so even some animals that don't really seem to have that much in common, when you get down to the specific things that actually make a mammal, they would have those things in common almost exclusively. So that's an example of a concept that you might use with young children. Now, using concepts is great because it allows you to really go in depth and to give a lot of good examples that can really stick. And you can use a lot of visual aids here as well. So what you want to do is to identify the features of a concept, define the concept for the students. So this is a mammal, and a mammal is going to be an animal that is warm-blooded. So a mammal is also an animal that gives birth to live young, unless you're a platypus. There may be exceptions to our definitions of the different concepts, but a mammal produces milk. So you have a list of features, and you give clear examples of different animals that would fall in that category if we're talking about the concept of mammals. And one thing you can do is to create a concept map, and you'll see this on the next slide, so I'll talk more about it there. I like to organize things for my kids, and we use dry erase boards extensively. So I like to make charts on our dry erase board with maybe the different types of animals, and then the different categories, the different features, and then have check marks, that kind of thing. So you can do something visual to show the characteristics of that particular concept. Developing a hypothesis. Now, I think we touched on this in our research slides. A hypothesis is basically your prediction about what's going to happen based on the information that you have, usually based off of a theory. So you might develop a hypothesis about what makes something a particular type of animal. Then you go out and test it. Then you go out and research it, find out if it's true. On a similar note, prototype matching compares items with similar items in a category. So if we then encounter a new animal, and we've never seen this animal before, we don't know anything about this animal, but when we do research on it and we find out, okay, well, it produces milk and it gives birth to live young and it has hair or fur, it's warm-blooded, so then it must be a mammal. So taking something new and comparing it with other items in that category to see, does this item belong there? Now, I'm using this concept of different types of animals as an easy example, but we don't stop using concepts when we're done with elementary school. For example, when I teach abnormal psychology, or when I talk about clinical psychology, mental illness is a concept. So we have an idea of what it means to be mentally ill, or what it means for a person to have psychological issues, and we have to have a definition of mental illness, we have to have a definition of psychopathology, so that then when we encounter a client or when we have some issues ourselves or in people around us, we know whether or not that fits under that category of psychopathology. Now, in order to do that, then we have to break that concept down into different types. So we know that psychopathology kind of generally means we have some distress, we have some dysfunction, we have some deviance here. Once we have that big picture idea, then we can say, well, there are different types of mental illness. So we have, for example, mood disorders and anxiety disorders and psychotic disorders. And so we make these neat little categories. Now, of course, the problem with trying to put people into neat little categories is that it doesn't always work out that way. But it does make it easier for us to understand the different characteristics. So, for example, all the people who have anxiety disorders have certain characteristics in common, and they belong in that concept. So we continue to teach concepts not just when we're talking about simple things in elementary school, but they can be more advanced concepts as well. So I have an example here of what a concept map might look like. This one is talking about reptiles. So you kind of grouping information here. General characteristics of a reptile, so egg-laying, vertebrate, external scales, breathing by lungs. And then you would also have perhaps different types of reptiles. Of course, if you're working with young kids, dinosaurs are typically going to be a favorite. So you might start there and talk about how they're similar to reptiles that are not extinct, that kind of thing. But this gives kids something visual, something to refer back to, something that helps them organize their new information. So we could just as easily make a concept map like this that had psychopathology, and we had the characteristics of what makes something an example of psychopathology. And then we could have categories for mood disorders, substance use disorders, or whatever. And this would allow us to also visually see a more complex concept. So it's not always just a simple concept. So to kind of summarize here, when you're teaching a concept, you want to provide clear, concrete examples. Thinking back to our lecture on Piaget, the younger the student, the more simple and concrete it's going to need to be. But you could still give concrete examples regardless if possible. That would be helpful. Relate new concepts to already known concepts. So think about the way that we teach math. Math is one of those subjects that we typically think of as this needs to be taught in a particular order. Sometimes things like spelling rules or different types of science, like do we have to teach about plants before we teach about planets? Not necessarily. But when it comes to math, there is a particular clear order, and that's because you are really building on the concepts that a child already knows. So the child has a concept for addition, perhaps, already. Now, if you're going to start teaching multiplication, I wouldn't bring out multiplication like it's a brand new concept you've never heard of before. You already know how to do addition, so let's talk about how this is very similar to addition. This is just kind of skip counting and addition together to make multiplication. So relating it back to information they already know makes it easier to learn and also gives them confidence because they know that they can master this skill. They've mastered the skill before it. We talked about concept maps, generating hypotheses about your concepts, and also one thing about encouraging students to generate hypotheses, it's okay if they're wrong. It really is. Let me assure you that when doing research, working on your thesis, you will have some hypotheses that will be supported and some that will not, and that's okay. It's actually very much so frowned upon doing research, having no real hypothesis going into it, and then after you have your results, trying to go back and say, well, see, these were my hypotheses all along. That's the wrong way to do science. You should come up with your hypotheses first, and if you're wrong, that's okay. When I do science projects with my kids, we have hypotheses about what we expect to happen, but I don't expect them to figure it out and have it all planned out the first time. That's why we do this research. Prototype matching, so compare new information that you come in contact with the items that are already known to be part of that concept to see if they're similar. Check for understanding, so providing opportunities for kids to encounter new prototypes and decide whether or not they actually fit trying to see if they can do something with this information besides just memorizing it, but actually doing some kind of project perhaps, which we're going to be talking about projects shortly. All right, now when we talk about cognitive psychology, we're thinking about mental processes. Of course, the first mental process that comes to mind is thinking. So we're going to be talking about different types of thinking. And before we do, there's a question here: can teachers teach their students to think? This is a tricky question. I think part of this depends on the age of the student as well, and it depends on what kind of student you have. So we already talked about how sometimes we have more surface learners versus deep learners, or more impulsive thinkers versus reflective thinkers. So I think it depends a little bit on the age of the student as well as what type of student you're working with. I think that teachers can model good skills here. And I think that when you actually go through a new problem you're trying to solve, or something new that you've encountered, thinking through it out loud and letting your students hear your own thought processes can be really helpful. So I think we can encourage this in our students. I'm not sure you can force a student to think, but I think that you can encourage it and model the proper kinds of thought processes. And to be honest, don't be afraid to make mistakes in front of your students too. As long as you can demonstrate how, okay, I messed up, let's see how we can fix this. Having your students hear you thinking through solving a problem and fixing a problem can be just as helpful as getting it right the first time. So don't be afraid to fail every once in a while. All right, so when we're talking about thinking, there are going to be different types of thinking we'll talk about. We'll talk about creativity, critical thinking, decision making. Decision making is going to be very similar to problem solving, which we will also touch on as well. But starting off with some general information here, thinking involves manipulating and transforming information in memory. So this is something where we know what it means to think, but we have to have a definition here. Now, we've talked about this a little bit already, about this information processing theory or idea, that we're similar to computers in a way. So we have an input of information, we store that information in our memory, and then we're able to do something with it. We can manipulate it, we can transform it. So your ability to take information that is stored and do something with it is really what we're talking about when we're talking about thinking. So a couple of examples of different types of reasoning here and different types of thinking. We could have inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. Now, one thing I do want to say, kind of referring back to our earlier lecture, is that although we are similar to computers in some ways, there are certainly ways in which we're different from computers. And being able to reason, being able to think critically is one. Making a lot of mistakes is another way. And we tend to be different from computers. And inductive reasoning is a situation where, unfortunately, we can often make mistakes. So inductive reasoning refers to going from a specific example to a general conclusion. So let me give you some examples of this. My daughter has red hair. I don't know if any of you in this class have red hair. I'm sure you're lovely individuals, but my daughter has red hair, and she also has a fiery personality. And oftentimes I tell people that when they compliment me on her hair, I'm thinking, well, okay, yeah, she's got the temper to go with it. But I could know a person who has red hair and a fiery temper, and I could say, okay, well, this one person, this specific example, this one person has red hair and a fiery temper. So then all redheaded people must be that way. I could generalize my results to, or my conclusions there, to all people who have red hair. Now, let's think about that. That may not be true. I'm not sure that there's any good research to suggest that your hair color determines your personality, or that your personality determines your hair color. No, that's genetic. Unless you dye your hair. Maybe certain personalities choose certain hair colors. I have no idea. I digress. The point is, there's no real reason to think that, but what happens if I have this belief that people who have red hair behave a certain way? That might change the way I interact with people who have red hair, and then therefore might change the behavior of people who have red hair. So that's that self-fulfilling prophecy. When you believe something is true, sometimes you behave in ways that make it true. Now, this is also potentially, in addition to just being a source of error, This is also where stereotypes and where discrimination and prejudice can come into play. So briefly here, a prejudice is just an attitude that we have about a person because of a group membership that person has. And it could be positive or it could be negative. Sometimes we like someone or treat someone more positively because of a certain group membership, like, hey, we like the same sports team, so you must be a good person, that kind of thing. But then, of course, we know that oftentimes prejudice is in a very negative direction where we think less of someone or mistreat someone. So what if you had a specific bad run-in with a particular person and you think to yourself, okay, well then all people like that person must be like that. Whether it's someone based on a religious belief. So all people who have those religious beliefs must then be like that person. Or all people who are of a certain gender or of a certain race or of a certain socioeconomic status or whatever the case may be. Sometimes we have a specific example that we then generalize, and then of course we start making mistakes at that point. And that kind of briefly, without going too far into social psychology, is how stereotypes and discrimination can happen. So certainly there are plenty of times where your specific example should not lead to a general conclusion. So, if you have a math teacher that you just love, and like, this is the best math teacher ever, that's a specific example. And then you decide you're going to major in math because you love this one math teacher, because you're assuming that all the other math teachers will also be awesome. Not necessarily. So sometimes inductive reasoning can lead to mistakes. Sometimes it can be right. Sometimes it can lead to mistakes. Deductive reasoning is kind of the opposite here, where you start off with something that is generally true, and then therefore this specific case must be true. So if I have mammals, for example, I'm thinking back to our animal concept. If I have the general conclusion that all dogs are mammals, which is true, so then specifically my dog, I don't have a dog, but if I had a dog, my dog is a mammal. That's a specific situation that is true because the general statement is true. So as long as the general statement that you started with is accurate, and this example is truly an example of that general statement, then it would also be accurate, right? Of course, anytime we're doing reasoning and thinking as humans, there's always the possibility that we'll make a mistake. All right, very good. Now, critical thinking is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. Sure, it's something that we would like to encourage in our students, but sometimes we don't know where to get started here, how to define critical thinking or how to encourage it in our students. So critical thinking is thinking reflectively and productively and evaluating the evidence. Now, I will say that sometimes critical thinking is discouraged in the classroom. Think about this. The teacher gives the information, the student is expected to memorize that information and then get that question correct on the test without really any kind of evaluating of the evidence, without going to look into the subject more, without maybe asking more questions, maybe talking to the teacher about your own thoughts and opinions here. We don't always encourage critical thinking. Part of this probably has to do with the pressure that we feel in maybe a public school system where you're having a standards-based test. You may not feel like you have the time to think critically. If this is something that's not going to be on the test, you might feel like it's a waste of time to go there. Of course it's not, but sometimes it might feel that way. But even in a college classroom, this can be challenging to do properly because, once again, you have a certain amount of material that you need to cover in a certain amount of time. You have a syllabus that you're trying to stick to and follow. And sometimes there's an opportunity to take a break from lecture and really go down this discussion path of talking about different ways that this might be true, might not be true, different ways that the research might be biased on this perhaps. And sometimes we don't encourage that, although we really should, because critical thinking is really what we're looking for at the next level of education. So if you go on to graduate school, you're supposed to be thinking critically, you're supposed to be critiquing. This is something I think I had a little too much fun with in grad school. I remember in one of my classes the professor would have us read research articles and critique them, And towards the beginning of the semester, he was like, "You're being too nice, you should really critique them more." And then by the end of the semester, he was telling me to stop critiquing. I was doing too much. So there's a balance there, but being able to evaluate the evidence. So when you're out in the real world and you're trying to make a decision, it would be a good idea to do some research and evaluate it. Of course, as we're going to see, sometimes we have some errors that we make here, but you wouldn't go out and buy a new car without doing research into which kinds of cars get the best gas mileage, how much will this cost on my insurance, that kind of thing. So critical thinking is really important to be able to solve problems and make decisions, some of the other things we're going to be talking about. So ways to encourage critical thinking, helping students construct their own thinking, rather than just telling them what to think. So giving students access to resources and then letting them come to their own conclusions. And of course, there's a limit to this. There's a point where you have to be able to answer the correct question. If you can't answer the simple question about the topic, then you probably can't apply that information and evaluate the evidence. So you do need to have a basic level of understanding before you start doing critical thinking. But once you have a good, baseline understanding of the concept, then you can start thinking critically. Use thinking-based questions that require students to use application. Maybe put students in groups so that they can hear other people's solutions to problems, other people's thoughts on the subject. Provide a positive role model. You either be the positive role model, which is great, or also providing other positive role models for thinking, having other people come into the classroom and talk about how they use critical thinking on a daily basis. Give some examples. We're going to talk about projects later. Keeping up to date. You need to do your own research. So this is one thing that's a little bit scary sometimes. When you're in college, you're being taught the most up-to-date information in whatever field you're in. But then when you graduate and you go on to the work field, you don't need to stop learning. You don't know everything. There'll be new things that will happen. So there have been changes to certain psychological concepts since I left grad school. I have to stay on top of those because I'm providing information to you guys. So you, in addition to the actual experience that you get in a teaching setting, perhaps if you're going to be an educator, you also need to keep up with the research as well. So decision making is another advanced cognitive process. It's an advanced process because it requires you to use a lot of different processes. There's a lot of reasoning, a lot of critical thinking, and a lot of problem solving that goes into making decisions. Now, I do know that different people approach decision making different ways, and that some of us agonize over decisions more than others. I would not say that I'm great at making decisions. Even something as simple as, where do I want to go eat for dinner? You really need to ask me that question about 6 hours before you want to leave, so I can have time to look at all my options and think about it. So some individuals are more logical in their decision making. I like a good spreadsheet, and I have been known to break out Excel when my husband and I are making decisions. That's probably the OCD though. I'm not sure I should encourage that in you guys, but regardless, some people go more with an emotional route, with what feels good, doesn't feel good, that kind of thing. But decision making involves thinking, in which individuals evaluate alternatives and make choices among them. So you need to be able to identify what your alternatives are, and then think about the good things and the bad things about each. Some of the issues with decision making come up with problems in your judgment, problems that we might not be aware of. It's usually a lot easier to pick out other people's errors in judgment than it is to see and admit to our own errors. But just a few examples here. I've got a couple here and some on the next slide. A confirmation bias is our tendency to search for information that supports our ideas. So let's say, for example, you're thinking about buying a new car and you've already decided, or you're pretty close to a decision, I think I want to buy this car. So then when you sit down to think about it and do research, you probably Google positive reviews of insert type of car here. And that's what you look for. You don't look for the negative reviews. You don't read the negative comments. You tend to zero in on the good things about the thing you already like. If you're trying to decide where you want to go to graduate school if you've already kind of come to some conclusions, you might start looking at all the positive things about that degree, about that university, or about that location, and not really take into account the potential negative things. I'll give you another example. The way that you educate your children. For me, this was an agonizing thing, and decision making is not really good for me, but it took a lot of really intense, serious conversations between myself and my husband before we came to any conclusions here. But I found myself leaning towards homeschooling, and I noticed that when I was doing my research, that's what I was looking for. Like having positive stories about homeschooling, or let's look at the research, which you guys should. The research on homeschooling this is not a homeschooling advocacy class. No. But I found myself looking into things about homeschooling that were positive, and I found myself engaging in this confirmation bias where I was only looking for something that would support my own opinion. So I had to overcome this by Googling like negative stories about about homeschooling. Maybe not having homecoming could be an example of that. No. What is wrong with me today? Anyway, or maybe something like the difficulties of homeschooling. So what do I need to be prepared for going into homeschooling that's not going to be easy, that kind of thing. Because we do have a tendency to want to believe that we're right, and so we tend to look for information that encourages us to believe that we're right. By the way, we do this with people too. If you meet a new person and you make this first judgment, hey, I don't like you. After that, you will only pay attention to the bad things about that person, and you will either A, ignore, or B, explain away all the positive things about that person because you want to think you made the right decision to begin with. Also, belief perseverance. This is the tendency to hold on to a belief in the face of contradictory evidence. So, let's say that you have a preference about where you want to go to school, and you've pretty much made up your mind, and then you go to visit the campus, and there are some problems. There are some major issues there. Well, if you're having this particular problem, you might say, well, that's not a big deal, or you'll explain it away. And when you do that, then you might be telling yourself that you're right, and you might end up feeling good about making the right decision, and then after you follow through with it and actually go to school there, you might regret it. So, if you are faced with some evidence that you're wrong, you don't need to be afraid of that. To be wrong is to be human. We all make mistakes sometimes, but it would be a tragedy if we continue to constantly tell ourselves that we're right instead of facing up to mistakes we've made and fixing them. Alright, so in addition, a couple other things that are listed here. We talked about the confirmation bias, belief perseverance. Overconfidence bias is it's a situation where sometimes we think that we're better at making decisions than we truly are. Or really, with an overconfidence bias, you think you're better at something than you truly are. Maybe you think you're a better judge of character than you truly are. Maybe you think you're a more ethical person than you truly are. Maybe you've met that person who has engaged in some questionable situations but still thinks that he or she is an example of perfect ethics, that kind of thing. Overconfidence is where we put too much faith in ourselves, and in that situation we're maybe ignoring the advice of other people who might be able to help us. And then a hindsight bias is after something happens, looking back on it and saying, I knew all along that was going to happen. So, for example, you get in a relationship with someone and you date this person for a while and then they break up with you. And you say to yourself, well, I knew this wasn't a good relationship. I knew all along that was going to happen. We tend to do that. It makes us feel better about the situation and feel better about ourselves. Like, I'm a great judge of character. The problem is that if you do this enough times, you'll start to develop that overconfidence bias where you'll think that you actually have better judgment than you do. So try to avoid all of these mistakes. One of the best ways to avoid these is to talk to other people and let the other people know it's okay for them to be honest with you if they think you are making a mistake. So you probably would want to consult with someone else before you make a major life decision. And you want to choose who you consult with carefully, because some people will not want your good, or some people will want good for you, but they're also not good at making decisions. So choose wisely there. Be sure to examine the costs and the benefits So as I said, we want to avoid a confirmation bias where we only focus on the good things about the option that we're leaning towards. We want to try to have as much as possible an unbiased approach here. And this may be where kind of that spreadsheet pro-cons list might actually be helpful. And then when you're trying to help your students to make good decisions, you want to talk to them about all these things, but also you want to be aware of the adolescent decision-making process. I think one of the best ways to do this is just to listen to adolescents talk. Listen to what really motivates them. Pay attention to them. As a teacher, as a parent, perhaps, my kids are still younger. It does terrify me, the idea of parenting teenagers, but I'm not quite there yet. But the idea is that adolescents may have different decision-making processes, may have different priorities than you do. So listening to them and also doing research, if you can find any research on the topic as well. All right, so we talked about critical thinking, about being able to evaluate the evidence. Creative thinking, on the other hand, is the ability to think about something in novel and unusual ways. So novel just means new. So we're going to think about something in a new way or a different way and come up with a unique solution to problems. Now, we already touched on creativity a little bit in an earlier lecture when we were talking about intelligence, about how when we're measuring intelligence, we would like to have a definition of intelligence and then have our tests measure the concepts that are part of that definition. But unfortunately, there may be some things that are very either closely related or actually part of intelligence that we don't include on our intelligence tests because they're too complicated to score or because it's impossible to standardize them, and creativity is a great example of that. So having someone produce a unique solution, that's not something we can have standard scoring for or standard administration of these questions. Some people might need more time than others to come up with a creative solution. And that's something that's hard to encourage with standardized tests, like, for example, intelligence tests. But when we're talking about creative thinking, it's going to be closely related with divergent thinking. So divergent thinking, not to be confused with the movie, potentially, or the books, potentially closely related. Divergent thinking produces many answers to the same question. So when you ask a question intended to stimulate some divergent thinking, there are maybe literally hundreds of potential answers here, and it may be that several different answers are correct. Not that we're comparing the correctness to a key, like you're supposed to have the exact same answer I have, but maybe the best way to judge this is, does it work? In a real-world situation, does it work? And there may be several different potential solutions to a real-world problem. On the other hand, convergent thinking produces one correct answer. So we're going from divergent thinking that produces several answers to convergent thinking, there's one particular answer. We start off with several potential answers, but only one of them is correct. So when you take a multiple choice test, you are engaging in convergent thinking. You start off with 4 or 5 potential answers and you narrow it down to the right answer. That's convergent thinking. Now, certainly convergent thinking has been highly emphasized in the classroom. In the name of fairness, I think, for one thing, because this allows us to score everyone based on a key, and so there's no subjective grading here. So we're going to talk about different types of questions in the next lecture video that you can use on an assessment, but something like an essay question might involve divergent thinking. There could be several different possible answers depending on the type of question it is. But with something like multiple choice, there has to be a correct answer and everyone's being graded by the key. Now, I am much more of a convergent thinker, whereas my husband is very creative. He's more of a divergent thinker. I'm sure that I already discussed this in an earlier video, but I've done activities in class before where I ask students to list all the possible uses of a paper clip. And so that's not convergent. There's not one right answer. And of course, the convergent thinker in me is going, yes, there is. It's to clip paper. But no, there are several different potential uses. And you wouldn't believe how creative my students could be with that particular assignment. So Some people will be better at divergent thinking than others. I think there are certain careers where a person would need to have more divergent thinking, and maybe certain careers where convergent thinking would be more important. So how do we improve creativity? Well, beats me because I'm not a creative person. I've never been able, maybe I've never tried to make myself a creative person. Maybe that's it. I do spend a decent amount of time on Pinterest, but that's another conversation. No, ways to encourage creativity. Maybe the best thing to do is just to get out of the way. So that's really what a lot of this is saying. Don't over-control students with very, very specific instructions. Sometimes it's okay to have an open-ended project where you don't give specific instructions. You shouldn't do that all the time, but sometimes it's a good idea. Encouraging students to take risks, allowing students to be creative. I think sometimes we get frustrated when people don't do things the way we do things, and that's kind of a natural tendency, but that's a mistake on our part, that we should let other people do things the way that works for them. So helping our students think in flexible ways, maybe just by allowing them to see that there may be more than one way to approach a particular problem. Even something that has a right answer at the end could be approached different ways. So, like, for example, there are different ways to teach multiplication. There are different ways to teach addition with carrying. And so whatever works for a particular student is great. That might not work for the next student. So even if we're going to come out with the right answer, the way you get there may be a little bit different. As long as you're getting there and it's efficient, then that works. Now, if it's taking 3 or 4 times longer to do it that way, then that might not work. But encouraging students to look for their own ways to solve problems, build their confidence. So when you see creativity, praise it. Sometimes I think the divergent thinker is punished more in a classroom setting, or at the very least frustrated if they're the kind of person that likes to think about things in new ways and they're discouraged from that. And there may be ways to use technology to help to improve creativity. There may be certain games that students can play, maybe group projects that students can do. Of course, not every topic lends itself to creativity, but some of them do, and we should encourage students who are naturally more skilled in that area, because I do believe it is a type of intelligence. It is important, and Sternberg would agree with me there. All right, next up is problem solving, which you're going to see is related to the conversation that we already had about decision making. So we'll talk about the steps in problem solving. We'll talk about some issues that can come up there. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can practice problem solving with projects and problem-based learning. So first of all, problem solving involves finding an appropriate way to attain a goal. So first of all, we have to figure out our goal. What is our goal here? Sometimes the goal is obvious, sometimes it's less obvious. It depends on the situation, but you need to know where you want to be, and you need to know where you are right now before you can come up with a plan to get you from where you are right now to where you are going. So I was involved in graduate school in a program called Coping Power, and Coping Power is intended to help adolescents who have some anger management, maybe some emotional control issues, helping them to, part of it was problem solving, making better decisions. So sometimes when you're feeling very emotional about the problem, this is difficult to do. And so having some steps to follow through can be helpful here. So the first thing you want to do is find the problem and frame it. Like I said, understand where I am and where I want to be, and try to understand the nature of the problem. This in and of itself can be challenging because sometimes we misunderstand problems. Sometimes because of our own personal bias, we're a little bit too close to the solution. So we say, well, okay, I'm failing this particular class, and you're emotional about it, and maybe you say, well, it's because the teacher doesn't like me, or it's because other students distract me. You might misunderstand what the actual problem is. So if you're having a hard time with this, talking to other people would be a great way to kind of gauge whether you're on the right track or not. So figure out what the problem is and the goal that you have, or how you want this problem to look like once it's resolved. And then developing good strategies. So one of the first things you're going to do once you understand your problem is to list all of the potential solutions that you can think of. And this was something we encouraged with Coping Power, all the possible solutions you can think of. You're having a relationship problem with a teacher. Literally list all your options. Like, dropping out of school is an option. Getting into a fight with the teacher is an option. Hang on. Don't judge me yet. Hang on. But we would literally let them list all the possible options because these options are going through their head. We need to address them. Once you've listed as many options as you can think of, then you go through and evaluate those options and think about the risks associated and the benefits associated with each one. So, for example, if you're having a relationship problem with a teacher, dropping out of school, okay, well, maybe that has some good things to it. It solves the problem. I don't have to see this teacher anymore. But let's also think about the consequences. The problem is that adolescents, their frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. And then also at any age when you're emotional about a situation, it's very hard to properly evaluate. And so sometimes we go with that first solution that pops into our head. So what we're trying to teach here is slowing down and evaluating the consequences associated with the different potential solutions. And so then once you choose a solution and you have evaluated it, and it might not be a bad idea to ask somebody else, like, hey, what do you think of this solution? But be careful who you're asking. Then actually test out that solution and see if it works. And if it works, great. Hey, problem solved. If it doesn't work, then you go back to your list of possible solutions and try to pick the next one that seems to be the most appropriate one. Also, you need to be aware that if you try out a solution and it works this time, it might not work next time. So this is a process we have to continually engage in. Now, there are a few problems that can come up, some obstacles here. When it talks about fixation, it's talking about a person not being willing to try something new. So if you've had a relationship problem with a teacher in the past and you have tried this conversation, this certain way of approaching it, and it's worked out great, then of course the next time you have a relationship problem with a teacher, you'll probably try the same solution. But what if it doesn't work? It might not work. Different teachers have different personalities. Different classes might have different issues that come up in them. So you don't need to be fixated on this particular solution like this is the only way to solve the problem. Remember, we made a whole list of potential solutions. So if one of them doesn't work, we need to go back to the drawing board instead of trying the same thing over and over again. By the way, some of this also applies to marriage counseling. If there's a couple that's having a communication problem, sometimes we try to fix it in a certain way that's worked in the past, and it just might not work right now, so we might need to try something new. In addition, you may have a lack of motivation. You may not want to solve the problem, which sounds strange, but if you follow with me here, sometimes the solutions that you come up with seem harder than dealing with the problem. Actually addressing the problem, going to the other person if we're having a relationship problem and telling them, hey, I'm not happy, there's an issue here, might be scary. And a person might say, I'd rather live with the problem than try to fix the problem. Maybe it's because of that. But it could also just be a person just doesn't care enough about the relationship. There are many different things that can cause us to lack motivation. But what if we have the motivation, but we don't have the follow through? We're not persistent enough. So maybe we come up with a solution. This is how we fix this relationship problem. But then we start it and it works well for a while and then we stop doing it. Because it's hard, because it's not natural for us, because we get distracted, or for whatever reason, or because we don't think the other person is putting in enough effort. So lack of persistence means we start solving the problem and we give up before it's completely taken care of. And then inadequate emotional control. This might initially make you think of a person who is angry, and so they jump to violence as a solution. And that could certainly be the case, but anger is not the only emotion that makes problem solving hard. Think about anxiety. People who have anxiety tend to be avoidant of things. So if you're anxious about a particular situation, you try to avoid that situation perhaps, or avoid thinking about it, avoid anything that reminds you of it. And so that could also make it hard to solve problems. Any number of emotions could make problem solving hard. All right? But we know that problem solving is important. And why is problem solving important? Because you have to do it every day out in the real world. So problem-based learning, which we're going to talk a little bit more about on the next slide as well, emphasizes solving authentic problems like those that occur in daily life. So this is something different from sitting your students down with a multiple choice worksheet. This is giving them an actual problem that they might face in real life, and then have them maybe be creative and brainstorm and work together, maybe in pairs or in groups, or have them work alone and have them practice their problem solving. So, for example, you need to get from point A to point B, but you don't have a ride. How are you going to get there? You got to get there safely. You need gas money, but you don't have gas money. We got to get gas money legally. Whatever the case, the problem may be, students are going to have to solve real-world problems. Maybe relationship problems might be something you practice with, because we know at some point we're going to run into people that are more difficult to deal with. So having students solve actual problems. We can also use project-based learning, which emphasizes working on real, meaningful problems to create tangible products. So we're producing something here, something that we can be proud of. So maybe if the problem we're trying to solve is hunger, maybe worrying about food shortages, that kind of thing, you could actually do a project where you could film a video, where you could make a commercial, where you could have a fundraiser, where you could create like a food closet kind of pantry, food pantry kind of thing. Something that you could do for the community, where you could actually produce something, and then students would solve a problem and feel great about having a tangible outcome that they can be proud of. Now, touching back on this problem-based learning about giving students a real-world problem to solve, we need to do this in the classroom. I think the reason that we don't is, first of all, because, as I've said, we feel like we have to teach the material that's going to be covered on the test. Maybe we feel like it's a waste of time, which it's not, but sometimes we feel like I have to cover this spelling rule, I have to cover this math concept, and so we feel like we don't have time for something a little bit more creative. But I also think part of the reason we don't do this is maybe we're afraid of how it's going to work out. We're afraid of having our students not get involved, or maybe having our students get involved and then produce solutions to problems that are not helpful. But remember what I said, it's okay to fail sometimes if we learn from that failure. So that might actually be the best way to teach students, to have them remember something. So provide them opportunities, monitor effective and ineffective strategies. If it's not going to be harmful to the student or to someone else, let them fail. This is something that's really hard for me with my kids. I see my kids doing something and I'm like, that's not going to work. And it's my instinct to fix it. And I have to wait and let them realize it's not working and let them fix it on their own. And if they don't realize it, then kind of gently pointing it out and letting them brainstorm ideas, but having them monitor whether or not their solution is working. Involve parents. I feel like parents need to be more involved in all aspects of education, regardless of where a child is receiving education. But this could be something that maybe a homework or outside of the classroom project. Sometimes students might struggle with this because they don't have the knowledge they need to solve the problem. Maybe they haven't really conceptualized the problem well, or maybe they don't have the strategies that they need. So the first few times you do something like this, you'd probably want to be heavily involved. Think about scaffolding here, where when it's a new concept, you provide a lot of help, and then as they start to understand, you withdraw your help so that they're not as dependent on you. So that's something that could be effective. And then using technology. So having students, usually with technology, it's easier for them to pay attention, but having them use resources to do research. So, wow. Back when I was in school, research involved books, but it does not have to involve books. It can, it still should. But using technology to do research on how other people have solved this problem before and whether or not it was effective. All right. Last concept that we're going to cover in this lecture video is going to be transfer. So we're going to define that and then talk about different types of transfer. Now, when we're talking about transfer, really this is where we know that learning has happened. Transfer refers to learning something in one situation and using it somewhere else. So this is the goal. I'm teaching you guys educational psychology. Obviously, I want you to memorize this information and use it on a test and get a good grade, do that. But also, I want you to learn some things here that you can then transfer to a different setting so that when you're teaching or when you're doing something that involves critical thinking, problem solving, I want you to be able to use what you've learned. So another way to think about transfer really is application. Can someone take the information and apply it? Now, a few different types of transfer here. Near transfer versus far transfer refers to the situation in which you use it. So near transfer happens where you learn the information in one setting and you use it in a very similar setting. So you learn the information in the classroom and you apply it on the state test. That's pretty similar. That's not that different. You learn the concept and then you apply it in a similar setting. But far transfer means you can actually use that information in very different situations. So, for example, I might memorize and learn all this about psychopathology. Let me assure you that it's very different sitting down with a client across from you and being able to access that information, understand the concepts, kind of screen to see whether my client fits into these different concepts that I have, and to know how to treat that issue. That's a very different situation. But something maybe more basic here, you teach fractions in a classroom, right? But then can you use fractions when you cook? Can you follow a recipe and maybe double a recipe or have a recipe and do that accurately because you understand fractions? So that would be using the information in a very different setting, which is far transfer. And then low road versus high road refers to how easy it is for you. So low road transfer, it says almost unconsciously transfers. So it's very easy for you. So if you learn fractions in the classroom incredibly well, and then you go out and you use fractions in cooking without even thinking about it, that's a low road transfer. You don't have to stop and draw it out and visualize it. You got it. You can do this. High road transfer is more difficult. It's more effortful. It's more conscious. It's something that doesn't come naturally to you. I think it depends in part on how well you learned it initially, as well as do you have a natural talent for whatever the topic is. So learning about psychology in a classroom setting and then going out and doing therapy with a client initially was a high road process for me. I had to try really hard. I had to really prepare before my clients showed up. But with more experience, with more practice, it became more of a low road transfer. It got easier to do. So as we said earlier, these things can become automatic with practice, with time, with effort. So what can you do to help your students transfer information? Well, giving them real world settings to practice in is basically what it means to transfer information. So having them do projects, having them do hands-on things to use what you're learning, as opposed to just worksheets. I mean, worksheets have their place. I'm not opposed to worksheets entirely, but students need to also have some hands-on opportunities as well. Root the concepts in application from the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, so that your students understand, first of all, how to apply this information, but also they need to understand that they will apply this information. I don't know if you've ever taken a class where you asked yourself, will I ever use this? For me, it was earth science. No offense to anybody who loves earth science. It just wasn't my thing. And I was thinking to myself, okay, I have to take this class because I have to graduate or whatever, but I'm never going to use this. So I think I would have done even better in the class if the professor had convinced me that maybe I would use it at some point. Okay, side note, totally unrelated, you will absolutely use educational psychology. All right, back to lecture. All right, teach for depth of understanding and meaning. So this is more of a reflective not just memorizing the information, but thinking critically about it, taking our time with it, and practicing it and reviewing it and going back to it. Just because you've covered a concept and students seem to understand it does not mean you can move on and you know the student has it. You need to go back and review it as well. Encourage students to engage in self-explanation. This is a great one. You may not be with the student out in the real world, so the student has to be able to think through the problem himself or herself. And so having them practice that in front of you, where all you're doing is just observing and only helping if absolutely necessary, but listening to them talk themselves through the problem, very, very valuable skill. And teaching students how to generalize, how to take what they're doing in the classroom to real-world settings, convincing them that they need to know how to do this, and showing them how to do this will be incredibly helpful. All right, so as I said, you do not have an activity associated with this particular lecture, so you'll just need to let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Our next lecture is going to focus on assessment. So we've been talking about all these cognitive processes, we've been talking about intelligence, so now we're going to talk about how to write tests to try to assess whether or not learning has happened. So we'll talk about that in the next lecture video. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, you guys have a great day.